Here, please do send me questions as I go along, or save them to the end, whatever works. I know we've already had some questions, so I will make sure that we leave time to try and answer those. If anyone can't hear me or something isn't clear, just let us know as well. I was going to talk about a couple of different things as explained. The first one was I was going to summarise a little bit the career that I've had. I was going to talk a little bit about one particular aspect of my career, which is to do with health policy, which is not something that all doctors necessarily do, but just goes to show the variety of things that you can have the privilege of being involved with as a doctor. I was going to talk a little bit about how passionate I am about the NHS and why, and then given today's events in Parliament and yesterday and probably tomorrow and who knows how much longer, maybe just make this a little bit real and talk about how the NHS is going to cope with Brexit. And then we'll focus on the key thing I'm sure you really all want to know, which is if you are interested in medicine, how you can apply and hopefully increase your chances of getting a place. So if I don't see a question, then just send it again, and between Joseph and I, hopefully we'll crack this. So my career has been extraordinarily wonderful, and probably not entirely, I would say, a classical doctor's career. So I started wanting to do medicine when I was about 13 or 14, which I think is probably normal for most doctors. And that was due to a number of things. One, at the time, there was a lot of news stories about doctors working in refugee camps all around the world, and that really piqued my interest. I have to say that I thought that I'd lived through those times and that wouldn't be something that doctors were called on to do again, particularly not in Europe, but I spent part of the summer before last working in a refugee camp for one of those organisations, Médecins du Monde, in Greece, so really in Europe, dealing with refugees from all over the world, and I can talk more about that if people would like. The second thing that piqued my interest was that it was just at the time when there was the height of the AIDS epidemic, and so there were a lot of stories, articles, and in fact one extraordinary column in The Guardian, which was converted into a book, which is called PWA, Person with AIDS, by a man called Oscar Moore, which is one of the most beautiful and moving stories of what it's like to be a patient in the NHS. And that really motivated me to want to do medicine. So I chose my A-levels. I did biology, chemistry and physics, although I have to admit I did that feeling slightly sad because I really loved history, and so I think I probably would have enjoyed the opportunity to do a bit more in terms of breadth, but that wasn't the way it worked then, and I know it's all come full circle, so it's probably not the way it works now. And then I applied to university, and I was very lucky to get a place to read medicine at Cambridge. So I spent 3 years at Cambridge, having the most wonderful time socially, academically, and really, if you ask me what I learned in those first 3 years, it was to speak a different language, because the language of medicine is complicated. Lots of words are used that I would never have understood, and obviously I learned a few facts along the way, but I think the main thing was being comfortable with the language. And then I moved, because at the time house jobs, your first job in medicine, were linked to where you did your clinical, and I knew I wanted to come back to London, so I moved to UCL and did my clinical at UCL. And by clinical I mean the time that I spent in hospital actually learning how to interact with patients, rather than the previous 3 years had all been about book learning. Again, it's important to point out that there are courses now which still follow that model, but most courses are much more integrated, so you start seeing patients earlier on, and most of the time now people don't move medical school halfway through. They start somewhere and they follow it through for 5 or 6 years. So I finished my clinical and I did my house job. Again, things have changed now, we have foundation jobs, and I did 3 different jobs in a year. So I did paediatrics, I did general medicine, which was actually rheumatology, and I did surgery, which was general surgery. And I just love the paediatrics. I love the interaction with the families, I love the diseases, I love the challenge of communicating and working with kids. And so I applied for the next stage of training, which at the time was called a senior house officer job, is now called run-through training or ST training. And I was lucky enough to get a job at Guy's and Tommy's, where I spent 2 years rotating around different departments. So I did general paediatrics, I did general paediatric surgery, I did renal, I did emergency department, I did cardiology, and I think that was it. And then I moved on to George's. So one of the threads you'll see, which is common to doctor training, is you move around a lot. I went to St George's and I did 6 months of neonatology, or I forgot I did neonatology at Guy's and St Thomas's as well. Then I came back to Guy's and St Thomas's and did a more senior training grade, we call that a registrar job. And then that's when my career took a slightly unusual turn. And so I applied for and was lucky to get the opportunity to work in the States, doing some research and policy work. And so I spent a year in Boston, not really seeing patients or doing clinical, but learning about the American healthcare system and how decisions are made by politicians and senior people in healthcare systems about how systems run. I came back to London and restarted my registrar training and did another year. And then I saw an advert in the BMJ and applied for a job, which was again different from the norm, which was working at the Department of Health. And I did that for 3 years. I actually morphed my role, so I was working for the Chief Medical Officer, working on a number of different issues at the Department of Health, but I also started to work simultaneously for the WHO, so the World Health Organization. So I've been very lucky to have an experience of healthcare policy and also international healthcare policy, and that was fascinating. So I left that role after 2.5 years, and then I did something also slightly unusual and went to work for a management consultancy, and did some work for them on how they could support the healthcare system in the UK. Did that for 6 months, and then I restarted my training, but again in a slightly unusual way, because I worked part-time doing my medical training, and part-time I worked as what we call a service manager. So I'm doing an administrative role running a service, not in paediatrics. I was running an ophthalmology service in a different hospital to where I was training. Did those jobs side by side for 2.5 years, and again I can talk more about what I learned in the service management role. And then I went back to pure clinical medicine and did a final year of pure clinical medicine as a registrar, and then applied for and got a consultant job at the Evelina London, which, as Joseph said, is based at Guy's and St Thomas's, specifically on the St Thomas's site in a very nice shiny building. And I've been there for 6 years now. And my day job is never the same. No 2 days are ever exactly equal, but I do a mixture of things. I do clinical work, so I see patients in the outpatient clinics, and I do those clinics in the hospital, but I also do clinics working alongside GPs, so out of the hospital. I work on the ward, so I look after everything from the high dependency unit all the way through to the normal ward patients, and they can be pure general paediatrics, they can involve other specialties. And I work in the emergency department, and I work in something called the short stay unit, which is where children can be admitted from the emergency department for 24 hours.
Sorry, Claire, can I just interrupt you there? Can
Yeah.
you please explain to our audience what kind of illnesses the children might come into hospital with that you have to
that I look after? Absolutely. Yeah. So a whole variety of different things. Everything from infectious diseases. I see kids with things like chickenpox, measles, or flu, or other respiratory viruses, all the way through to children who might have diabetes, or children who might have asthma or epilepsy, or abdominal pain secondary to all sorts of things, or headaches secondary to all sorts of things. So very varied. But then I also support my colleagues with children who have other long-term conditions where they need a kind of general opinion. So that might be a surgical patient who's had an appendicitis and things aren't going perfectly in their recovery, so I might support that, or children who have tracheostomies, or children who are on ventilators, or children who have had ears and throat procedures, so really, really varied. So that's one part of my job. The other part of my job is I'm really interested in how you can change healthcare systems. So I spend a day a week working on a big project that we've been funded for by the Guy's and St Thomas's charity. We've been working on this for 8 years, and we have created a new way of doing things for primary care. And so we are trialling that at the moment at scale. And if it's proven to be successful, then we'll roll it out across all of the GP practices in Lambeth and Southwark, and actually more broadly than that. And the third thing that I do is I manage just about, well, slightly more than a third of the Children's Hospital. I have a team of a general manager, myself, and a head of nursing, and we support 120 consultants, around 800 staff in total in that directorate, and that directorate covers everything from allergy all the way through to the neonatal intensive care unit. So my day is never really very similar. So I'll stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions, or whether you have any questions that might fit with that before we go on to the next bit.
I suppose just what is your typical working day?
Yeah.
So what did you do yesterday, for example?
Yesterday, let me try and think. Yesterday was Tuesday, right? So yesterday I started off at 8:30 with a meeting around the transformation project that I talked about, and then we had a series of different meetings. I met with GPs, I met with other paediatricians, I met with nurses. We went through some cases of children who were particularly complicated, where we needed to bring together mental health teams and physical health teams. And then I had meetings with the outpatient team to think about how we could streamline our processes. Then I spoke to a few parents and a few nurses about some specific clinical issues. Then, what did we do in the afternoon? Then we had some more meetings, and then we had some meetings that were specifically with all of the key providers of healthcare and commissioners of healthcare in Lavers and Southwark, so the clinical commissioning groups, the GP systems, the other acute hospitals, so King's and South London and the Maudsley. And then I think I finished, where did I go yesterday evening? I can't remember. Yes, I finished at about 5:30, and then I went off home to do various bits and pieces. So that was a fairly contained day. But for example, last week on Tuesday and Thursday, I started at 8:30 and I finished work at 9:30 because I was on the ward. And when I'm on the ward, I go and review patients. I support the juniors. If the patients are very sick, then I might actually get involved in that direct clinical care. Then I went home, and then I was on call, which meant that I got a few calls overnight about sick children, either from the emergency department or from the ward. And if those children had been really, really sick, then I would have come into the hospital during the night. So very varied.
Fantastic. I think we've got a question from
Excellent.
the floor.
So let me read the question out in case people can't see it. You've talked about your route into medicine. What sort of work experience would you recommend to students who are interested in a career in medicine? Okay, so that's a great question. I think it is useful to have an experience in medicine, so to do some work experience. I don't think that it's necessary to do vast amounts, so as long as you've either been in a hospital or spent time in primary care, just so that you, if you're asked, can start to give a personal reflection on what that might be like. I think it's also useful to do work experience slightly broader than medicine, so if you can spend time, when I was in the sixth form, I spent time every week working in an old age home, visiting a pensioner, and I also spent time similarly supporting a local care home for disabled young people. And I think that taught me almost more than just a snapshot of spending a day, but I appreciate all of that can be difficult to organise. So I think any relevant experience you can get that you can then use in interviews or application forms can be really useful. Okay, I will crack on then with the next bit. So the bit of my job that I didn't talk about is another bit, which is I have a title which is a totally unclear title, which is the Associate National Clinical Director for Children, Young People and Transition. And essentially what that means is that I give a little bit of my time to NHS England, which is the big body that oversees the delivery of healthcare in the United Kingdom. And what I do there is try and make sure that the needs of children are remembered and that they are slotted into all the streams of work that go on. So, for example, at the moment there's a big piece of national work on how to improve the technology that the NHS uses, and I keep putting my hand up and saying, okay, that's lovely, but what about children? So they are doing some specific things around children as a result, not just of me, but many others saying that. One of them is so that patients can carry their own electronic health record in the form of we at the moment, if anyone has a sibling, you will know that you have a red book when a baby is born, and we are creating an electronic version of that. And there's lots of things about how that information is shared and who owns that information and the technology behind it and the accessibility. So those are the things that I help support from a clinical perspective. That's my policy role. And then if we go on to the challenges and rewards of working in the NHS. So I passionately believe that we are unbelievably lucky to have a nationally publicly provided healthcare system that is practically free at the point of delivery. I say practically because we do pay for prescriptions in some circumstances, and there are some other costs, things like parking and things like that, but in the main it's free. And having been a patient myself recently, I'm very, very aware that not worrying about how I'm going to pay for something was inordinately useful when it came to my recovery and my stress levels. I also think as a clinician it's incredibly liberating to treat every patient the same, or at least treat every patient differently based on their clinical need, not based on their financial situation. And I have seen other healthcare systems, whether it's America or Canada or Sweden or Australia, and I know that the same is not true in those other healthcare systems. However, because it's publicly funded, there is a budget that we have to stick to. That budget is over 100 billion, and that's gone up in recent years. We spend about 7 to 8% of our gross domestic product, so that is slightly less than our European neighbours and dramatically less than our American colleagues. They spend around 15%. Part of the reason why their spend is so much greater is because we are publicly funded, our bureaucracy is much less, but also the choices that they make are different. And so there are constraints on what we can do. We have to argue the case, we have to prioritise, so it's not all rosy. And in particularly financially constrained times, our biggest cost is salary. 2/3 of the NHS budget goes on people, so one of the things that often happens is salaries get curtailed, or at least they don't go up with inflation, or if they go up with inflation, they don't go up above inflation. So there are definitely challenges to being publicly funded, but hand on heart, I think it's one of the things we should be proudest about in England is that we have a healthcare system which is publicly funded and which does incredibly well. There's an independent organisation called the Commonwealth Fund. It's a policy group in the United States, and for the last 3 years they have ranked the United Kingdom as the best of the systems that they look at. So I think we should be very proud of that. So again, I'll stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions, or if you have any questions.
Yeah, I'm just going to...
We're going to jiggle that.
Shift that back up.
The camera keeps dropping, sorry, so you lose half my head. Any more questions that people want to share with us?
I've got a question. Why do a lot of doctors feel that they have to go sort of, and work in the private sector, or why is that such a big draw? Is it anything other than the money, or?
So, I actually don't think that many. If you looked at the entire population of doctors, I think if my numbers are right, there are about 120,000 doctors in practice at the moment. In consultant or GP equivalent grades, there's obviously more junior doctors, but they're not necessarily eligible to do private work. I think that the finances do make sense to some people. I think for other people, they find the bureaucracy of the NHS frustrating and they prefer the liberation of the private sector. I think that occasionally there are some things that can only be funded through the private sector, but I think the creation of NICE and the increasing ability of the public to make their views known through social media or through other mechanisms means that if there are treatments that should be looked at, they're increasingly looked at within the NHS. I don't think the private sector is perfect, and many doctors, I don't do any private work, but many doctors who do work in the private sector say it comes with a different set of issues and problems. Nor do I think that people should take away from this that doctors are badly paid and need to do private work. I think we are incredibly privileged and we earn very decent salaries, which are generous in terms of the ability to increment, if not year on year, then every 5 years. So I definitely don't think you should take away from this that you need to do private work, but that is an option for some people. It sort of depends where. I think if you're London based, it's probably easier to access that compared to if you're in a smaller place where there maybe isn't the demand.
Sure, that leads nicely actually into another question we had put in advance, which was about the junior doctors strike a couple of years ago. And I was just wondering if you could possibly give a little bit of background as to what the strike was about, whether it was about pay or whether it was about conditions.
So I think it was a combination of both. I think what sparked it, and as with many of these things, there are a number of factors, and then there's generally a kind of catalyst that pushes it from a disagreement into something like that. I think the first thing to say is junior doctors did not choose to go on strike easily. These are incredibly committed professionals for whom making a decision not to do something and potentially put patients at risk, although more senior doctors like myself managed to cover the wards, so actually patients weren't put at risk, but they were definitely, things were more complicated and they had to wait longer potentially. So I think what drove it was that the negotiations that had been going on, that go on regularly every few years between the British Medical Association, which is the kind of trade union for doctors, and the NHS, had broken down. And I think that the doctors felt that they weren't being heard, and this was the only way to keep the focus on what they were feeling was appropriate. I think the actual final agreement probably wasn't that far away from some of the initial offers on the table. There were just some nuances to it. So, for example, pay didn't dramatically change, just the way it was calculated changed, and also the safety mechanisms to make sure doctors weren't being exploited changed. So we now have something called, it always makes me think of Guardians of the Galaxy, but the Guardian of Safe Working, who exists in every hospital trust, who monitors how many hours and what doctors are asked to do and how they're asked to do it. So do they get their rotas, their timetables in advance? And if they're being asked to do more than they're contracted to, we have a duty to fill out various forms so that they can either be recompensed financially or with time back in lieu. So do I think that junior doctors are particularly excited about the way things have changed? No, but they do feel like things have moved forward. I don't think it's something that people would resort to again easily. But we have similar negotiations coming up for the consultant contract, so watch the space, who knows what will come out of that.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll go back to the last two sections that I said I would cover if there are no more questions. The first one is around the NHS and Brexit. So I spent most of Monday evening in a meeting being updated on what the Brexit plans are. I think suffice it to say, a lot of people have spent a lot of time doing a lot of thinking about this. One of the major areas, and there are many areas that have been looked at, is what's going to happen in terms of medicines and what's going to happen in terms of medical devices. And every single medicine and every single medical device that is used in the NHS has been examined, the supply route has been thought about, and mechanisms to manage if that supply route is closed down because of problems getting shipments into the UK has been produced. So the NHS has contracts with alternative providers so that routes other than the normal route, which is generally across the channel, so essentially Calais to Dover, have been set up, and they include dedicated routes just for the NHS. So we know what volume of trucks we require, and we have sufficient capacity for those trucks in these alternative routes if required, even taking into account that we know that there may be delays at the borders. So we are expecting that the time it takes these trucks to transit through customs will change, but we've factored all of that in, plus we've built in a buffer and warehoused extra stock, and we have emergency access routes through planes. We have planes that we can charter if necessary, or space on planes that we can charter if necessary in order to bring in emergency medicines. So that's one element of Brexit. The other element of Brexit is what happens with staff. So we've done a lot of work to encourage EU nationals who work within the system now to apply for the necessary permissions to stay. However, we know that for a lot of people, it's not just about the actual what happens in their role, it's about do they want to stay in a country that isn't in the EU, and so that has implications. And then perhaps the most tangential but also important bit of Brexit is that we have a large number of particularly older people who live in the European Union, who have retired there, who at the moment are able to access free healthcare through various mechanisms in the country that they've retired to, like Spain or Portugal or Italy. But actually, if Brexit goes through, they will technically not be entitled to that. So what decisions will be made by them or for them? So there's been a lot of work to support that. There are another whole set of work streams, but I won't go into it. But suffice it to say, a huge amount of time and energy has been spent on this, and the scenario planning has been based on both a no-deal Brexit, a delay to a decision on Brexit, and whatever deal is eventually struck, that will have to also have a scenario plan as well. So not particularly how some people thought they would be spending their time, but really crucial, because we can't have the NHS grinding to a halt because we run out of a crucial, I don't know, medicine or needle or theatre device or neonatal cot part. Any questions that you've had on that? Or any questions?
So there was one that was sent to me before. Again, it was about stockpiling of medicines, and I guess the point of the question was about what proportion of our medicines actually come from abroad, and what proportion are made in the UK.
So I can't give you the answer to that, and that part of the reason I can't give you the answer to that is because it's incredibly complicated. Because even if medication is made in the UK, the constituent parts may not be made in the UK. They may come from outside of the UK. So again, that has been worked through by the NHS policy team who deal with medication, and they have worked incredibly closely and are working incredibly closely both with individual pharmaceutical companies, but also with the kind of conglomerates or the associations which support the pharmaceutical industry. And they are helping them to make sure that all of the relevant paperwork that needs to be done is done, so that if things change, depending upon whichever scenario I just laid out for you, there can still be the flow of if not the medicines, then the constituent parts. However, there are extra resources being made available to keep extra, I don't know if it's really stockpiles, but extra volume, so that we try and run very, very tight systems, because we don't have space in hospitals to store large amounts of medication. So we try and have a system where you only order it when you need it, and then it comes in and then it's used and it goes around. I think most hospital wards only keep a couple of days of stock, and then obviously the pharmacies in the hospitals keep a couple of days of stock. Certain drugs more, because it can take longer to produce them. So it's a complicated logistics game, but one that has really been thought about a lot. No more questions. Okay, so now I'll go on to the penultimate, well, really the final bit before we take a more open round of questions, which is what would I say to young people applying for medicine? So I think it's an amazing career. As I hope you've seen, you can do many things within medicine that are probably not the stereotype of what you see a doctor doing, I don't know, in casualty or ER or scrubs or whatever model, whatever television program or equivalent you're interested in watching. And even if you do choose to do pure clinical medicine, within that there's a massive variety. So what a GP does day to day is very different from what a trauma surgeon does. So a GP would see patients in their general practice, so in a clinic environment, and might do some home visits, might do some visits to care homes, whereas a trauma surgeon's world might be seeing patients in clinics in the hospital who've broken limbs, or they might spend their day in the emergency department dealing with people who are brought in after accidents, or they might spend time in a theatre operating on limbs, either pushing limbs back together or reconfiguring them or doing things like that. So there's no norm of what a doctor's role is. And then many people study medicine, practice medicine for part of their career, and then they go on and they choose to be academics, so they do research, or they choose to be educationalists, so they spend lots of time training other doctors or other health professionals, or like me, they have an interest in management or policy, or they might choose to go and leave medicine behind entirely, but use the skills and the knowledge they've acquired, go and work in the pharmaceutical industry, or go and work in advertising related to healthcare. The list of things you can do following on from medicine is endless. I think when people ask me what makes a good doctor, I think being interested in science is useful, but I think being interested in people and wanting to interact with people and being curious about people is really important. But I don't think there's a particular stereotype. I don't think you need to be a particularly loud or brave or non-queasy person. I think that you can find your route in medicine. I know when I started, I would have characterised myself as fairly shy and cautious. And over years in medicine, I've had to learn how to be a bit braver, and that has come naturally. It's not been something that's been forced because of the support I've got from colleagues in the work environment. And in terms of what to put on your application form, we've talked already about the importance of work experience, but I think also try and think about what motivates you beyond the obvious. Try and read, whether it's newspaper articles or scientific journals or medical journals or books, and try and draw that knowledge. No one is going to expect you to know that you want to be a paediatrician or know you want to be a neurosurgeon, or if you do, that's great. But they are going to expect you to want to be curious and be interested and be willing to learn. So, if you said to me tomorrow you can go and spend the day following a neurosurgeon around, I'd be delighted to do that because I'd learn something new and have an interesting conversation. So it's that curiosity, I think, that's crucial. And then when it comes to the actual process, you obviously do your special exams in order to apply to certain medical schools, and then there's the application form itself, and then there are interviews, and those interviews can be formal interviews, so someone sitting across you or a few people sitting across from you asking questions, or they can be a setup where you rotate around a series of different tables, and you might get asked one ethical question, you might get one question on something to do with the science that you're learning at school, and one question about your work experience, and so on and so forth. So there are different ways of structuring interviews, and then you get obviously offers, most of which are conditional on exams, although if you're applying after you've got your exams, that may not be the case. And then you hopefully are successful in going to medicine. And the final thing I would say is, I know a lot of people don't get into medical school the first time they apply. Some choose to reapply and they get in the second time. Some choose to do other subjects which are allied to medicine and then apply for graduate entry. And some choose to take a year off and then think about reapplying. I don't think it matters. You're not a better or a worse doctor depending upon how you got into medicine. I know that the former medical director of the NHS, so one of the most senior doctors in the NHS, used to say that he applied to tens of medical schools and only got into one, and then didn't do as well in his A-levels, and I think had to reapply, and he became one of the most senior doctors in the NHS. So the way you get into medicine doesn't determine anything about how good you are as a doctor or what your future career is going to be like. I'll stop for a second. Any more questions?
That's great. If there are any questions on the floor, please do type them up for Claire. And whilst you're typing those up, Claire, can I just ask you about sort of how you see your next steps, or like what the future holds, you think?
That is a very good question. So I love what I do at the moment, and I really am hugely committed to the place that I work in. As I said, I've been there on and off for a number of years, and I would be very sad if my role didn't continue to allow me to keep seeing patients for a considerable time. But I also really love supporting teams to develop and change and supporting other colleagues. So the medical management role is important to me. What that looks like, I don't know. It partly depends on what opportunities appear. So I have colleagues who are in similar positions to me who go on and do medical director roles within hospitals. I have some colleagues who will go on and do chief executive roles in hospital trusts or in primary care. I have colleagues who move into policy roles or things like that. That is my work phone, which I will pick up. I have colleagues who choose to go off and do much more senior roles in other countries, working for other organisations. I talked about the WHO or places like Médecins Sans Frontières or Médecins du Monde. I don't know. I'm a real believer that you have to enjoy what you're doing in the moment, and then when you get that slight niggle of it's time for a change, talk to lots and lots of people, read lots of things, look at lots of adverts for things, test what matters to you, and then if you're very lucky and the opportunity arises. But I know that my career path is unlikely to be a clear linear progression. I've already described how it's diverged and converged and moved in different directions in different countries. So we'll see. But for me, the place that I get the most energy from, the thing that gives me the most sense of satisfaction is the interaction with patients. So today I was on the phone to a mum because her child had treatment in the community. It wasn't working. She went to the emergency department. It didn't quite work out, so I phoned my emergency department colleagues and my specialty colleagues. They came down and saw the child, and now we have a new plan. And that, I feel like I can go home at the end of the day feeling like it made a tiny difference to someone's life, but hopefully it was a useful difference.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
More questions?
Are there any more questions from our audience, please? I'm typing that.
Is that?
Yeah, someone, yeah.
Okay. That's a good question. So the question is, what's the biggest challenge facing medicine in the next 20 years? I think people would expect me to say technology and how we accommodate and change to technology. There's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and how that's going to take away the need for doctors or nurses. I don't think that's totally true. I think artificial intelligence will support doctors and nurses and allied health professionals. For example, in radiology, it may be that more scans are read initially by artificial intelligence, but the interaction with people is unlikely to be totally done by robots or artificial intelligence. So it will free us up as people to do the bit that really matters, which is the holding people's hands, supporting them on their journey, listening, but in a way that's useful, because the volume of information that we're expected to hold on to is just exponentially increasing, and so having technology behind us to help manage that is really crucial. So I don't think that's the biggest challenge, although many people might. I think the biggest challenge is actually around workforce. Well, I'm going to have two challenges. One is workforce. So how we encourage people to take jobs in the NHS. We know we have a huge number of vacancies, particularly in nursing, and we need to address that, otherwise our healthcare system is going to fall apart. And the second one, and I think this is really crucial, is we have a national health system that we should be really proud of, but our social care system, our provision for people who have social care needs, and I'm not talking about pensions, I'm talking about actual interaction, so people who are dependent on social care to provide for their needs in their homes or in sheltered housing or indeed in care homes, is not particularly successful at the moment. And I think if we don't crack that, you're going to see increasing demand put on the NHS to balance the lack of capacity or lack of quality in the social care system. And with an ageing population, and with a population that is increasingly subject to complex diseases, because we can do more now than we could 20 or 30 years ago, if we don't address that, we're going to run into a terrible pickle and potentially make the NHS as we know it unsustainable. Excellent.
Okay, so thank you. It looks like that might be it then today, Claire, unless there's any more typing in the next 30 seconds. But thanks so much for coming in, and I will forward this recording on to our audience and the other schools as well as a bit of information about the King's College outreach programme for potential medical students as well. So thank you for that information. And okay, so I think that's going to be it for this week, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time, everyone who's tuning in. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.